if any of you saw the keynote speaker this morning, David, he did a great introduction to this, because he said actually costing was important. And then he went on to say that benchmarking was important to understand how you stood against your peers. And that's really what I'm going to talk about, both those topics. I'm going to talk about costs, and I'm going to talk about benchmarking and maturity. Who here generates cost or receives costs? Anybody? Yeah, we all do. I mean, as project controls, it's got to be the basis of what we do. We need to understand exactly what the program or the project is going to cost us, and then we're going to monitor ourselves against that project or program. But how good are the numbers that you get? Are they really good, or are they just sort of average, or are they poor? Somehow you need to be able to understand the quality of the estimates that you get to begin with. And that's what we've been doing in Kinetic. We've been looking at it and trying to assess and gauge the maturity of the organizations that are around. And we've been doing this for a number of years now, and I want to just introduce you to the idea and see what you make of it. So I'm a fairly sad person. All I've done all my career is estimate things, okay? My children say when they introduce me, Dad guesses for a living. But, you know, it's not true. There's a lot of science involved in estimating. It's an art, yes, but also there's a lot of science involved in that. And that's what I've been doing for the last 30-odd years, is estimating and forecasting, generating numbers. Okay. So for this presentation, what I'm going to do is a bit of an introduction. Who's Kinetic and what are we? Discuss the cost engineering health check that we've been researching and building. And we've been doing this for some time now. And then just trying to give you an indication of some of the metrics that we're using to judge whether an organization is mature in terms of their estimating ability or not. So we're going to look at what we would see as best industrial practice in terms of data gathering, normalization, and application. Look at tools, look at people, processes, and then ultimately culture and leadership and management, and then just wrap all this up. So just to give you an idea of what we think and how we consider maturity in terms of cost generation. Okay. For those of you who have not come across Kinetic, we're a fairly interesting organization. Basically, we don't make anything. We don't build anything. All we do is blow things up. Okay. We're actually the Ministry of Defence test and evaluation organization. So when the MOD buys stuff, we actually take it and we ensure that it's fit for purpose before it enters service. So we shoot missiles at Shrewsbury Ness and see if they go bang. We take ships and tanks and aircraft at Boscombe Down and make sure that they do what they say on the tin. We are purely a test and evaluation service. Within the international business, there's a part that's advisory services. We're about 150 consultants, externally focused, highly professional, based in 5 sites, deployed around the world. So we've done this health check in Canada, in Australia, and around all over the place. Done it in America, and I'll show an example of how America compares to the UK. And lots of qualifications. In simple terms, what we do is we are helping people to make complex decisions, okay? And some of the analysis techniques you see on the left-hand side are the techniques we deploy to help them and assist them in making complex decisions easy. Cost is just one part of it, but also we look at capability assessment, operational analysis, and so forth. We look at risks, and we help people to make those complex decisions. One of the nice things about working at Kinetic, though, it also gives you lots of pretty pictures to use in presentations as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is the cost engineering health check. Okay, it's our benchmarking tool. Having been around the costing community for 30 odd years, it's fairly sad to say that at the end of those 30 years, my whole career can be parceled up into sort of 4 pillars, okay? So we believe in a philosophy of knowledge-based estimating. If you want to do an estimate that is credible and justified, rather than just an opinion, everybody can have an opinion as to what things cost, but if it's going to be credible and justified, then we believe in knowledge-based estimating and the 4 pillars of data, tools, people, and process. So if you're going to have a good estimate, you need historical data that represents the financial information of historical projects and the contextual information. So you need to know, what did you buy? Was it 1,000 widgets or 10,000 widgets? Okay, you need to understand the context of that information. We need tools, so statistical models and aggregation tools, tools that we can use to analyze that data and make sense of it and use it again in the future, use it for predictions. We need people who can interpret that information. If you were listening to the presentation from the SSRO this morning that Ian gave, you'll understand that he emphasized it's important that you understand what are in those historical projects and the context of them. You need good people who can do that for you. So how mature, how good are the people that you use? It's important. And finally, process. You need a process which is repeatable, because certainly in the defense domain where we mainly work, we have scrutineers. And scrutineers, heaven forbid, occasionally disagree with the estimates that I put forward. I don't understand it, but there you are. But if we have scrutineers challenging what we're proposing, if we use the same data, the same tools, if they're as skilled as we are, and they use the same process, then they should be able to come to the exact same conclusions that we draw. So when we're looking to benchmark and put together a competency framework, those 4 pillars seem like a good place to start. And in addition to that, if we wanted to really judge how mature an organization was, we wanted to add the other 2 on the far right-hand side around stakeholder engagement and cultural integration. For us, if you're doing an estimate, anybody who's doing an estimate, you can't stand in the shadows. You've got to be out there, engaged with stakeholders and understand what it is you're estimating, all right? You can't estimate in a vacuum. You need to be engaged. And you need to be fully integrated in a culture where estimating is part of everything we do. So that was important to us. Why estimate? Why look at the maturity of this? Well, what we wanted to do originally when we started this research was to figure out what good looked like. Okay. We've been doing it for a number of years on risk management, and we have a risk management maturity process. And the 2 charts at the bottom here are not very clear, but what you can see here is the results of our risk management assessments. The blue bars that are fairly well contained demonstrate and result in maturity assessments which are very mature. Organizations and projects which have a mature process. And as a result, the overspend and schedule constraints are very good. Whereas the orange bars for risk management showed a lot less maturity in terms of risk, and the overspend and schedule slippage resulted in a lot greater magnitude. So having seen that it worked in the risk domain, risk management domain, we wanted to see if we could apply it in the cost domain. And we wanted to know how good were organizations in terms of their maturity, judge them against themselves, and judge them against their peers and industry standard to see how good they stood. Now, you can have a lot of fun with this stuff. We've done this all over the place. We've done it for 4 government departments in Canada. We've done it for the Cabinet Office. We've done it for prime contractors and small industries. Essentially, the process is the same. First thing you ask is, what policies do you have? What procedures, what guidance, what training do you have? The far left-hand square. Just send me your documentation. And when the government department doesn't send you anything, that tells you something about the level of maturity to begin with, all right? After that then, what we do is we do electronic voting, which is a great fun, okay? It's a bit like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire when they ask the audience, and the audience comes back and presses a button, and you get a live response. You get that feedback straight away. What do you think of this option? Okay. So we have a workshop, we ask 38 questions about the maturity, because it's one thing to be sent processes and procedures and guidance. It's a completely different thing when you ask, do you actually use them? You get a completely different picture and a different level of maturity and assessment. So through the workshop, the second stage here, and electronic voting, we tried to tease out of the audience how good are they at actually applying what the heads of department think they actually do. The third part is obviously writing up a report and identifying improvement opportunities. Where there are weaknesses, then we look to get better. We look to help to mature organizations. We can do this periodically. Certainly in the risk area, in the risk maturity assessment, we've seen an example, lots of examples where we can do this periodically and we can judge how much better you're getting at doing these things. How do we measure that level of maturity? Straightforward 5-step process, all the way from level 1, being completely naive. We've had organizations that can't even spell the word cost, let alone apply it, you know. All the way up to level 5, the optimum. To us, level 5 organization is where everybody should aim to be. And we always caveat that with, if you had unlimited amounts of time, if you had unlimited amounts of resource, this is what you should be doing. And looking to judge ourselves against those benchmarks. These sorts of outputs that we can then provide, this tool against the 6 criteria look like this, where we can judge, in this example, that, you know, people is really mature. They've obviously got some good people going here. But on the downside, stakeholder engagement is perhaps low. So we can look at adjusting that and identifying areas and activities with the organization to help them to mature. I don't expect you to read this, but we can then rank those activities as where are the low-hanging fruit, how can you get better quickly, which are the activities that are easy to implement, and which ones are not so easy to implement. Interesting example, anecdotally, in defense, we're always told about the Americans, hey, those Yanks are so much better than us in this tiny little island. So we took this to America and we tried it. And anecdotally, against some of the questions we asked, yeah, they are good. They are good. They're better than us. They have freedom of information. They have data that we don't have in the UK. They have databases at their fingertips. NASA does integrated cost and schedule risk analysis. But there are some areas also that the UK, the Brits were good at as well. So it wasn't all skewed towards the Americans. You'll notice that nobody ever scored the maximum. And it's not about scoring the maximum. It's not being the optimum in all of the criteria. The idea here is that what you're trying to be is better than your peers, better than your competitors. At least towards the top, you want to be in the upper quartile of this assessment. So let's look at this in a bit more in detail then. When it comes to data, what are we looking for in a mature organization? What is it that represents a mature organization? I'm going to go through some of the things that we assess and some of the things that we ask when we're doing these assessments, to give you a bit of an indication, and ask yourselves the question, are we mature? Are we in this area? Okay. So data is the first one we look at. This is a picture, this is a great picture, I love this one, of the wind tunnel that we have at Farnborough, one of the biggest wind tunnels in the UK. You can see the guy stood there. It's huge. But in terms of a data-rich organization, we're looking for an organization that has historical project cost data at their fingertips. They have a database, okay, of their historical projects. Not just that, but they have a technical data as well. That technical data gives it context. We understand what it was we built and how much it cost. We have historical schedule. So we have an understanding of how long it took to do these tasks, these activities, this project. Risks and opportunities. What actually occurred during the project? What deviations were there from the original numbers that we set? What opportunities were there to make things faster, cheaper, better? Did we record that against the project? Trends. Do we keep indices about inflation and cost trends? Yeah? Do we actually have a data-rich environment? We're using this information. Yeah? If we don't have data, do we make sensible assumptions over the lifetime of our project? So if we don't have information readily to hand, as we go from assessment to concept to manufacture to deployment and production and in service, from making assumptions on the left-hand side, do we have through the life cycle a mechanism for a process sensibly replacing assumptions with hard fact, with data as we go through a project? In a data-poor environment, do we have a mature approach to making sure we have justification for the numbers we put together? Do we normalize the data that we use? Okay. So if we have information, if we have factual information, do we normalize it in a sensible way, in a meticulous way? So do we normalize cost data for currency? Do we bring it all to a single currency? Do we bring it all to a single economics? Or do we use data which is spread over all different types of economics, historical information? Do we consider the effects of quantities, learning curves? Do we think of theoretical first piece? Do we consider the difference between fixed and variable costs and normalize it in that sense? Recurring and non-recurring costs. Do we consider and stratify the data that we use? Do we take the technical information and look at it in terms of metric and imperial? Number of users. The schedule duration. Do we normalize the schedule in terms of days, months, years? Do we bring it all to a common currency? How good are we at doing this? How mature are we at actually using this information? Kinetic's not perfect. I mean, we're not at the top of this benchmarking scale by any sense, but we're looking to get better. One of the examples we have is, we have a data repository, many of them. One of them is the observatory that we use. Okay, we have over 2,500 technical papers in there about program, portfolio, and project management, which we can call upon to learn from other organizations. So what about tools then? How do we apply this maturity assessment to tools? Most people, when they think about tools, think about cost models, grab Excel. We all love that tool, okay? We grab Excel and we dive in there. We start programming. We start writing equations. Okay? We get very excited about this. In a mature organization, what we're looking for is a more systems engineering approach to this. Okay? We should be looking to identify what are the requirements. What is the specification for this model? What is it we actually need it to do before we dive into Excel and start writing maths and equations? Okay? Because it's only through doing the requirements that we can identify some sort of test plan, we can do some sort of validation and verification. Does the model actually do what we need it to do? It's only through this mechanism that we can give it a user guide. We can actually give it to a third party where they can actually use these models and these tools. Okay? I know it's not the sexy bit. It's the boring, the tedious, the paperwork bit, but you know, if we're going to be a mature organization and do this sensibly, then we need to approach it in a professional and mature way. Kinetic's not perfect, but we have generic tools that we use, spreadsheet models. We have parametric tools that we apply. So we have Facet, which is a family of advanced cost estimating tools that we license to third parties around the world as a parametric approach. People. We need people, we need SQEP people. We need people that are subject matter experts in this. Experienced, knowledgeable, qualified people who do this work. I always think that in costing, we need to be a jack of all trades and a master of none, really. So in terms of knowledge, what do we need? We need a depth of knowledge in our particular discipline. We need to know costing. We need to know something about finance and commercial attributes. But also we need to know something. We need an awareness of so many other topics, different types of engineering. We need a breadth of understanding. We also need to be able to communicate, okay? We need to be able to understand, in a mature organization, we need to be able to understand and communicate with the guys that we're mentoring. We get people in from university who we try to bring and promote and encourage them into our discipline. So you need to be able to discuss and talk at their level, but also when you're standing in front of the managing director and the CEO, and trying to persuade them that actually your figures are right, you need to be able to talk in a different type of language. You need to be able to be persuasive. So there's a whole host of different types of communication, knowledge, and understanding that you need as a costing person if you're going to do it well, in a mature way. You need to be a jack of all trades, a master of none. You need to have some appreciation of things like the organization that you're estimating. The technical knowledge, what is it that you're estimating, okay? You need to have an appreciation of maths and statistics, taking historical data and extrapolating into the future, conducting regression analysis. How do you know if that data is statistically significant and makes a good trend for the future? You need to have commercial knowledge. I'm never going to make a commercial manager out of us, but at least you need an awareness of this. Financial experience, obviously. A number of times that I've had accountants try and fob me off with data, only to find that when I get back to my desk, it's all accruals data, and I want cash. I don't want accruals, okay? But you need to know what sort of information you need. You need to be able to communicate, and you need interpersonal skills. There's a psychology to estimating. When you're taking information from people, you've got to give them something back. Okay. You need computing and IT skills. Who doesn't these days? And you at least have to understand the principles of project management. When you're putting together an estimate, a costing, You need to be able to manage it as if it's a small project, a program. Okay? Understand what it is you're actually producing. I sat down with the cost team earlier in the year, and we started on a sort of a Friday afternoon, looking at all these disciplines and trying to make a diagram of it. And we ended up with something that looked like this. A tube map, essentially. The red line represented all of the competencies that we thought we required, and then lines came off of that, different branch lines appeared as to what do you actually need to know about finance, commercial, so on and so forth. Come past the Kinetic stand and pick one of these up. They look good on the wall. And when the boss asks you, what do you need to know? Isn't it just about adding up? This estimating stuff, it's just adding up. You can actually point to this and say, no, actually, we need to have a bit more knowledge than just adding up. We need a process, okay? A rigorous process to understand what's going on. And we need to utilize that process, okay? Again, David in his keynote speech this morning talked about super projects and breaking super projects down. That's very true. If we take a portfolio of defense programs, okay, nobody can sensibly manage a whole government department of programs and projects. It's just impossible. There's too much going on. So what do? In defense, we break it down. So we break it down into program level. Even at program level, we can't deal with that complexity. Eventually, we break it down into projects, and individual projects, then, we're more able to manage. But we wrap that up with scrutiny and governance. Okay. That's how we subdivide the projects. But those projects require different types of analysis. One type of analysis doesn't fit all, as I'm sure you're aware. So right at the top level, we do balance of investments, options analysis. We look at, do we need 2 aircraft carriers, 40 tanks, 2 ships, and 1,000 soldiers, or some other combination? What is the combination that ultimately we should be looking for our armed services? At enterprise level, we're looking to maintain an industry. So if it's the maritime sector, we need to make sure that we're providing a good throughput of work through the maritime sector to make sure that we maintain an industry. Okay. No good putting peaks and troughs through. And then ultimately at project level, we need to be able to make options analysis. We need to make decisions. And what we hope to do with a mature organization is have sensible decision making in complex projects. So at project level, what we're looking for is something like this. Okay. We identify a gap in capability, a requirement, a need, a concept of analysis that lays out the analysis that we're going to do, identify all the options that are available, then consider it in terms of benefits, operational analysis, measure of effectiveness, and then cost. And then bring the two together to make sure that what we're getting for the cost makes sense and is the optimum solution, and put together a business case to get there. It might look simple, but you'll be surprised at the number of projects that I come across where they're halfway through this process and don't know where they're going or what direction's up. It is astounding, In a mature organization, we need to make sound decisions, have a sound decision process that makes sense. In terms of the costing, then, I'm a great advocate of applying multiple methodologies. If you're providing an opinion, one methodology, one cost, that is just an opinion. Okay? But if we apply multiple methodologies into in terms of how long is this project going to take and how much is it going to cost, what's the boundary, then we can give more confidence. We can be a mature organization. So we can look at analogous projects. It's somewhere around there. It's somewhere in that envelope our ultimate project's going to fall. We might look at historical trend analysis, a different approach to analogy. Okay, maybe we're making that envelope a bit tighter. We might look at parametrics, a scientific approach to it, looking at the key cost drivers and looking at cost estimating relationships. And again, tightening that envelope until perhaps we do a bottom-up detailed estimate. We have a lot of knowledge and a lot of data. And again, we can see where that output falls. Providing all those analyses to a decision maker gives him a lot of confidence, rather than a single point in, believe me, sir, believe me, ma'am, it's going to fall there. Just doesn't run. It has to be a number of approaches. A good, mature organization will have a number of approaches at their hand to enable them to provide that rich picture of possible outcomes. Now, as a decision maker, now you make a decision where you think the estimate's going to finish up. In Kinetic, we have a number of processes, and we keep them in Wikipedia and a wiki site to make them nice and easy to access. Finally, I just want to touch on culture, leadership, and management, because estimating can't be done in isolation. We need to have a culture where we're talking to people, where we're engaging with the rest of the project teams that we're working with, where we're engaging with subject matter experts in their field, understanding why this project is complex, why this project is difficult, why this project has never been tried before. Costing in a mature organization is going to be fully integrated, okay? It will touch on all the other decisions we're making. Supportability, availability, spares costing, operational analysis, supplier assessment. All of these areas we're going to be touching upon and looking at and trying to influence in a mature organization. In a mature organization, we're going to be looking at making sure that there's feedback into our estimates. So when we've done an estimate, we use that estimate as a basis of your project controls, using it as part of your earned value management systems, and baselining that estimate. As we work through our projects, a mature organization is going to take that information, those actual costs that result from that project, and feed it into a knowledge base so we can calibrate ourselves. We didn't anticipate some of these changes, we didn't anticipate some of these difficulties, but now we understand them. Let's not make those same mistakes again. Feed it into a knowledge base that we can then use to influence our estimating in future, our costing in future. So a mature organization will have a closed loop, and we'll have learning and feedback and calibration around its costing. So just to wrap up, just to finish, pull all this together, I'd just like you to reflect on how mature you are at costing, how good you are in your organization or individuals or projects at pulling together estimates. How do you benchmark against best practice? How do you compare with your peers? Would you put yourself at the top of that pyramid? Would you put yourself at the top quartile of the range of competitors? How can you improve? What do you need to do to improve, and how can you get there? I thank you very much for listening to me. And if you have any questions, I'll gladly take them.
Hello. It's not a question, but what are your thoughts on big data and the impact of that on things like this? Is there much difference, or is it just sort of larger data sets, but the same process to understand what that data means?
Okay. Big data is an interesting one. Obviously, the first and the priority should be your own data. So you have to differentiate between your own data and external data. So you can buy historical information, project information, but it's a lot more relevant, obviously, when you're forecasting and estimating to use your own information. If you've got access to large databases within your own organization, then it makes it a lot easier to find and extrapolate things like analogous projects going forwards, or create cost estimating relationships within those projects. So, yeah, I would emphasize the need for your own data first, and if you're not gathering your own data, and believe me, I've seen a number of organizations that don't think it's important to gather their own data, that would be my emphasis. But if you then have external sources, that's always good as well to set benchmarks, especially if you're looking at target costing or should costing. If you can get access to other information, that can give you a rich vein of information.
Should a cost engineer be embedded with the design engineers to make sure that there's an cost influence at the outset, at early optioneering stages? Yeah,
I'm firmly of the belief that systems engineers make good cost engineers, to be honest with you. If there are any accountants in the audience, I wouldn't recommend accountants. My brother's an accountant, and he's got two left hands when it comes to car mechanics and things. He really doesn't understand the mechanics of it. And I've interviewed people of that nature, and they understand the financial side. But when you start asking, what's a ship made of? Can you describe the subsystems of a ship? They have no perception, no idea. So my preference, certainly in the defense industry, would be for looking at systems engineers, technical engineering background, and then provide them with the tools they need to just readjust them. And another way of thinking of this is, I don't consider myself any different to any other engineer, but instead of looking at watts and volts and thrust and newtons and speed, I look at dollars and pounds and euros. That's the only difference, really.
It's kind of a vague question, but from your chart, from 1 being novice and 5 being the greatest,
yep,
the companies that you deal with, where do most companies fall within that range?
Well, we assess projects and organizations, and they fall between 2 and 4, generally, to be honest with you. I've come across some projects recently which are pretty diabolical, and it does shock you, and it shocks them as well. When you start asking these types of questions of them, then they become surprised of their own immaturity in some of this and wonder why they haven't been doing some of these things themselves. Okay. Anything else? Are we all done? One more.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It focuses a lot on estimating. What about the cost control element? How Kinetic implemented in the organization?
Yeah. So we do have questions that we ask around P3M and earned value management tools and risk management tools and things of that nature. So it's not purely focused on cost. It is looking at some elements of project control as well. And it's exactly the same. It's benchmarking in the same sense, looking to see how good you are against your peer organizations. So we do consider those aspects, certainly. And as you saw in the last slide, to us, project controls is an integral part of costing. You know, we need to be able to have that feedback mechanism into our estimating through project control. So if we don't have a mature project control organization, we're never going to achieve that recalibration of our estimates that we're generating. So it's important to us, definitely.
How did you go about coming up with solution if the cost has overrun against your estimate in Kinetic? You know, most of the time, how did you do that?
Oh, in Kinetic, of course, all of our projects are perfect, so we don't have that problem. But should hypothetically we have that problem, then yeah, I mean, it's looking back as we saw from our the presentation that was in here previously. Yeah, it's about requirements, changes that have happened inevitably during a project. And one of the most common themes I see is just lacks paperwork. You know, it's not picking up on changes. The requirements change, but industry doesn't just pick up on those requirements. People don't want to follow up with the paperwork. They are very keen to get on and do the engineering and find that solution, but who really wants to negotiate the change? Yeah? And as a consequence of that, the baseline stays the same, the changes aren't recognized, and in a lot of cases, the overruns or the delays are as a result of that measurement against the baseline that's no longer relevant, in my experience and my experience. Okay. I'm aware that I'm stood between you and your lunch. Thank you very much.